want to comment on this tweet I saw from Apostate Prophet. He says, Muslims and Christians do not worship the same God. I don't care who argues they do. The Islamic Allah is fundamentally different from God in Christianity. He is of a different origin, has totally different morals, and is ignorant about the God of the Bible and his words. Now, I know a lot of Christian apologists, conservative evangelical, who would avidly agree with Apostate Prophet. However, I think there are several concerns with his tweet that I want to raise now. The first thing I just want to point out is to say whether Christians and Muslims worship the same being is an ambiguous question. It could be, do they refer to the same being when they perform speech acts uh, in reference to a deity called God or Allah? So that's one issue. Do they refer to the same being? Another issue would be what we would call a soteriological issue, which would mean in terms of salvation, can Muslims and Christians both be in a salvific relationship with the same divine being? And that's another question. And no doubt there are other possible ways to interpret this as well. But the one thing I would want to say is we really need to be clear on what we're talking about when we say do not worship. Are you saying they do not refer to the same being? Are you saying they cannot both be in a salvific relationship with the same being? Uh, the one thing that's interesting is no doubt every one of us has many false beliefs about the divine, assuming the divine exists. No doubt every one of us has false beliefs about the divine, but that wouldn't of itself preclude us from being in relationship with the divine. So one would have to explain, well, what are the things you have to be wrong about that would undercut your ability to refer to the divine or to be in worship, salvific relationship with the divine? So then apostate prophet says, well, look, Allah is fundamentally different from God in Christianity. What he's doing here is he's holding up ostensibly two different theological accounts of the divine. One is the Muslim account and the other is the Christian account. Now, I know orders of magnitude more about Christianity than I do about Islam. So let me begin by just talking about Christianity. There is no one conception of God, of the divine in Christianity. There are multiple incompatible accounts of the divine. For example, there is an account that says the divine exists, say, in and of itself, independent of all other creatures. It is atemporal, impassible, has no real relation with creation at all. And that is one of the mainstream theological interpretations of God, one of the accounts of the divine in Christianity. Another account of the divine in Christianity is that God is in time, that God suffers, that God is in relationship with creatures, and that God changes over time. So those are two different conceptions of God. There's an Arminian conception of God that says God is truly omnibenevolent, that God loves all creatures, and the only reason that not all creatures are saved is because God is not able to save all creatures while respecting their free choice to choose Him. And then there's a Calvinist reform view which says that God is not omnibenevolent in the sense of loving all creatures equally, but that God has a special electing love for the creatures He chooses to save, that he does not extend to those that he chooses to reprobate, either through an active decree of reprobation or damnation, or either by passing them over or refusing to elect them to salvation. Either way, many people have noted, I think rightly, that the Calvinist conception of the divine has very similar hallmarks to some of the theological conceptions of the divine in Islam. So if we were to say that, as apostate prophet does here, that Christians and Muslims don't worship the same God because they have different theologies of God, one would probably be backed into the corner of saying that Arminians and Calvinists do not worship the same God, or process theists and classical theists do not worship the same God. One could say that, but I think that has some pretty problematic implications. So, uh, the last thing I wanted to say is I'm going to now just say a brief word about Islam. As I said, I know orders of magnitude more about Christianity than I do about Islam. Hold on, the dog's barking. So I might be inclined to get angry at Timbit for interrupting me, except that I know he has the IQ of a turnip. So I want to be patient with him. Okay, now I was going to talk about Islam. The one thing I want to say is that I know enough about Islam to know that just as there is an enormous diversity in Christianity in terms of different divergent theologies of the divine, so there is enormous divergence and variety within Islam when it comes to different theologies of the divine. And what I often see from ex-Muslims who have, I'll say, an axe to grind against Islam is that they're going to focus on the theologies, probably the theology that repelled them from Islam, which often is a particular take on Islam that one might call fundamentalist or otherwise maybe very off-putting. Um, and there are other theologies of Islam. For example, I've seen different theologies of Islam than what I think apostate prophet describes in forms of Sufism. So the same diversity that you get in Christianity, you get in Islam. And so there is a deep error here in assuming that these are just two incompatible theologies, Christianity and Islam. Rather, there's a continuum of theologies. And as I've said, there are particular theologies of the divine in Islam and in Christianity which share some key hallmarks with one another that they do not share with other theologies of the divine within their respective religious traditions. So to conclude, I think there are multiple problems with this tweet from apostate prophet.